Assalamualaikum and greetings to everyone. I am Jazmina Bazla Iskandar from Universiti Malaysia Sabah UMS. Today, I'll be sharing the findings of our research titled A Scenario-Based Assessment of Multimodal Transport Strategies for Carbon Dioxide Mitigation in Malaysia. So this work was done in collaboration with colleague from Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, UKM, and Middle East College in Oman. So let's begin by understanding why this issue matters so much. Now let we start with the introduction. Transportation is the second largest source of global carbon dioxide emission, accounting for over 22% of the total in 2023. Motorcycles and cars made up half of the fleet in 2022 but were responsible for a disproportionately high level of emissions. In fact, during peak hours, 2.2 million motorists enter Kuala Lumpur, showing how reliant we are on private vehicles. Therefore, to contribute in reductions in carbon dioxide emission, this study will promote the usage of multimodal transport as a sustainable transportation strategies. So what is actually MMTS or multimodal transportation strategies? So MMT is the combinations of more than one mode of transport, including public transport, non-motorized transport like walking or cycling, and also cleaner freight logistic. They're not only helping in reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide, but also improving the urban livability. For instance, switching from a private cars to buses able to reduce the emission up to 42%, and if we are switching to a rail or train, we will reduce the emission up to 73%. So countries like Singapore and the Netherlands have already implemented MMTS successfully. However, in Malaysia, there's a lack of localized scenario-based study in focusing on implementing these strategies. So, this study will focusing on aiming to address these implementations of MMTS in Malaysia. Our study had two key objectives. First is to analyze 10 years of vehicle registration and carbon dioxide emission trend in Malaysia. Secondly, to evaluate 3 scenario-based multimodal strategies and estimate how much they could reduce the emission by the year 2030. So what are these 3 strategies? The 3 strategies that we are assess are first, public transport expansion, which are encouraging users to shift from cars and motorcycles to buses and trains. Secondly, non-motorized transport (NMT), which promoting walking and cycling for short trips. And lastly, freight logistic optimization, which are shifting good transport from road-based lorries to rail. For the methodology overview, our approach involved 3 phases, which we began by collecting vehicle registration data from 2014 to 2024, alongside emission factors from sources like UK government and IPCC. Then, we estimate the baseline emission based on this data. And finally, we modeled 3 mitigation scenarios under different model shift assumption, which are 10%, 20%, and 30% to project the potential emission reduction. So, before we able to calculate the emissions of carbon dioxide, we need to set the emission factor for each mode of transport. So, different mode of transport have different emission factor value. For example, cars, the emission factor is 0.168. Meanwhile, buses has a lower emission factor which is 0.041. So, we also factored in vehicle capacity, load assumption, and also average trip distances, which we set to 100 km to ensure accurate and fair comparison. Before moving into the emission trends and scenario modeling, let me briefly explain the core equation used in our analysis. First, we use the compound annual growth rate (CAGR) formula to calculate the yearly increase in emission from 2022 to 2024. This will help us to project the baseline emission for 2030 more accurately. Then, we calculate the total emission by multiplying the emission factor for each mode by its activity level, such as vehicle kilometers, passengers, or freight trips. All of this data you can refer as the table that I shown previously. To estimate the potential reduction, we apply the carbon dioxide safe equation, so which we subtract the emission factor of the new mode from the original mode and multiplies the difference by the shifted activity level. Lastly, we convert the saving into a percentage using the projected 2030 emissions as a reference point. These four equations underpin all the results you will see in the upcoming scenario. Now, we reach the results and findings of this analysis. So we start with the baseline trend from 2014 up to 2024. So over the past decade, transport emission increased by 20.1%, rising from 19,000 to 23,000 tonnes. Cars and motorcycles remain the dominant contributor, while lorries, although just 1.3% of the fleet, are responsible for 8% of the total emissions. So this highlights the urgent need for a shift in how we travel, and that where our three mitigation scenario comes in. So here you can see the projections from 2025 to 2030 and the percentage changes, and also the emission changes for the carbon dioxide in also 2025 up to 2030. Here also you can see the bar chart comparing the vehicles and also the emissions for each mode of transport. In this bar chart, you can see that even though the growth of mode of transport is lower, but the emissions from that mode of transport able to produce a higher compared to other mode of transport. For example, here you can see the lorry. Even though the growth are much lower, but the emissions are quite high due to the higher emission factors compared to other mode of transport. So now we come to the first strategy or scenario, which is the public transport expansion. So for the first scenario, it focuses on expanding buses and rail-based transit with a better coverage, frequency, and accessibility. The goal is to shift cars and motorcycles user, which consider as a private vehicle, to a low-emission public transport. So policies like fare subsidies and transit-oriented development (TOD) able to support these strategies. A survey showing that 48% of respondents would switch to a public transport if it were faster and more affordable. So the results are promising a 10% modal shift able to save up to 1.2 kiloton of carbon dioxide per year, increasing to 3.6 kiloton with a 30% shift. Next, for the second scenario, we're focusing on a non-motorized transport, NMT. The second strategy promotes active transport such as walking and cycling, especially for a short trips under 5 km. This involves building bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, and a safer urban design. Aside from cutting emission, NMT able to improve air quality, public health, and also reduce congestion. Our finding shows that a 10% shift to NMT could cut up to 4.7 kilotons of carbon dioxide and at a 30% saving reach up to 14.2 kiloton per year, which are the highest among the three strategies. Lastly, for the third scenario, we address the freight emission. Lorries, while few in the number, account for 90% of emission due to their heavy load and diesel use. By shifting freight to rail and waterways, we can significantly reduce this footprint. The implementation will require logistic hub, intermodal terminals, and also rail investment. The emission saving here range from 247 ton at 10% shift to 741 ton at 30%, which consider a meaningful reduction from a high emitting sector. So when we compare the three strategies side by side, we found out that first, NMT, which is the second strategy, offer the greatest carbon dioxide reduction potential, which up to 58%, thanks to its zero emission nature. Second, public transport provide a balanced solution with a strong social and also environmental co-benefit. And lastly, freight logistics, even though they are smaller in volume, they target a higher emission factor, resulting a higher emissions of carbon dioxide. So together, these strategies form a comprehensive and data-driven path toward transport decarbonization in Malaysia. To conclude, this study highlights how multimodal transport strategy able to help Malaysia significantly reduce carbon dioxide emission by 2030. So first, we know that cars and motorcycles remain the biggest contributor. Second, lorries are few but highly polluting. And lastly, the combinations of NMT, public transit, and freight optimization present a powerful solution. But in order to achieve this, we need to have a policy alignment, infrastructure investment, and also support for behavioral change to transition away from a car-centric system. So following are the references that we referred throughout this study. And thank you for your attention. I would like to express my appreciation to all co-authors and institutions involved in this research. For question, feedback, or potential collaboration, feel free to contact me via my email, or you can comment in the comment section below. Thank you.